Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. It is Wednesday, 10 December 2025, years after Jesus. We're coming to you about Brexit today and about immigration. We have to broach it at some point in detail on the Republican Professor podcast. It's tied up with some of what we've seen and what has surprised people in the United States with the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and with the pushback against the autonomy of the administrative state, which we're seeing by the Republican Supreme Court in the United States. There's some links here. And to help us through this material, one of my favorite writers on American politics is named Chris Caldwell, wrote this piece in the Claremont-Review-of-Books. I highly recommend the Claremont-Review-of-Books to you. Why hasn't Brexit happened? You'll see that I have the hard copy, which is a paper copy you get in the mail. It's like a magazine. It's very well done. It gives you something to read on an airplane if you don't want to look at a screen. It gives you something to read while you're driving if you don't want to look at a screen. LOL. Ha 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 ha. I like to read these when I'm having a cigar, maybe a wee bit of whiskey, yeah, to mix my Irish and German accents together for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe it's Helmut Tielica and my Celtic ancestry. I don't know. So this, lucky for you, is made available for free, people, on Claremont Review of Books website, which I'm going to show you right now. Go to ClaremontReviewofBooks.com, search Brexit, and this is the first result that comes up, people. So this is what it looks like when you search Brexit. You get different results there. Okay. This is the one I'm clicking on. It's summer 2019. It may be objected at this point, why am I going back to summer of 2019? I want something current. No, you don't. You do not want something current. Yes, I do. No, you don't. You need to go back and to understand what's happening now, you have to have a context. So it can't be all what's going on right now. That's the problem with people who have their nose in their phone for the latest updates every 2 seconds. You miss any kind of context. In summer of 2019, 3 years after Brexit was voted on by the British people, you have a title like, Why Hasn't Brexit Happened? That itself is worthy of thought. You want to sit in that. Let's sit in that. The subtitle is The British Constitution in Crisis. We'd like to thank Christopher Caldwell for writing this. We'd like to thank Claremont Review of Books for making it available. Go to ClaremontReviewofBooks.com and get a subscription, even though this is not behind a paywall, this particular article. You get in the mail something with artwork, something you can hold in your hands. You can see my copy's been beat up a bit because I've taken it when I'm sitting there waiting for my car to get fixed at the auto mechanics or whatever. I'm sitting on the couch in Dan's garage, which used to be Craig's Auto, which is on Whittier Boulevard in Whittier. It's near what used to be Oil Can Henry's. It's now a Valvoline. It's near the Whitworth Mall, which used to be an indoor mall. I don't know if you know that. Did you know that? So we have a wonderful reading today. Let's get to it, okay? Let's do it, man. I'm going to share my screen. Feel free to call me Sharon. Throw some business Claremont Review of Books his way. We're going to do we're going to make a fair use of this, do a transformative reading, and think deeply about it. I'd like you to really think about what this is saying. And I'm going to refer to my paper copy because I have notes written in my paper copy. Incoming British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's first address to the House of Commons on July 25th coincided with the arrival of a heat wave so devastating it sparked talk of a global warming apocalypse. This is 2019 summer. Steam rose out of the Thames. Overhead electrical wires melted on the London Luton train line, and Cambridge University Botanic Garden registered the highest temperature in the history of the British Isles. 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Jeez. Naturally, there was joking among political pundits about hot air and a government meltdown. But there were darker grumblings too. This was a descent into populism, one could read in the pages of The Guardian, The Independent, and papers from the European continent, that the conservative Johnson had moved into the prime ministerial townhouse at 10 Downing Street meant that Britain was now under the control of a clown, a saboteur, or worse, the British equivalent of U.S. President Donald Trump. Remember, this is summer 2019, so this is well into the Trump presidency. I also want to take a moment and point something else out at this time. You see the login button up here? Yeah, I am not logged in. I do have a login. I'm not logged in. I want you to know this is made available to the public for free. Claremont Review of Books does that. They give stuff away for free. I'm trying to drive some traffic to them. Why? Because they are worthy of the traffic. This is stuff I don't want us to forget. I don't want this to get buried with everything that's going on, because I think it's very important that we get a handle on this. Some kind of handle. Whether one backed the antic, mop-haired Johnson or not, it was obvious at a glance that he exhibited none of the traits that the adjective populist is usually meant to evoke. Eton and Oxford educated, and those are preschools, I think, in, where? Probably Kent, or no, Wales, in the mountains of Wales. Eton and Oxford educated, he has been a foreign correspondent, editor of the venerable weekly The Spectator, the mayor of London, and until his resignation in 2018, foreign secretary. The real grounds for elite hostility toward him lay elsewhere. Johnson came to office promising do or die, as he put it, that the government would honor its commitment to withdraw the United Kingdom from the 28-nation European Union October 31st. In a long-sought 2016 referendum, okay, so this is, when he references July 25th up there, he means 2016, I think. Okay, all right. Just pointing that out. In a long-sought 2016 referendum, British voters had approved this British exit, or Brexit. At a time when British politicians of all establishment parties had stood against Brexit in almost unbroken solidarity, Johnson had made himself its most prominent backer. Gonna take a sip of coffee. I'm gonna pause it so you don't hear me slurping. Not pause it, but mute it. Looks like I didn't unmute myself. Wow, that was stupid. I finished the dadgum article. All right, I'll go back to where I was. Johnson's conservative predecessor, Theresa May, found the job of implementing the referendum's mandate either beyond her powers or not to her tastes. More than 3 years later, Britain remains stuck in the EU. Man, Johnson has taken a different tack. He has burned the ships. He nominated Dominic Cummings, an architect of the referendum campaign, to mastermind the implementation of Brexit, and filled his cabinet with convinced Brexiteers, purging every last gloomster, to use his vocabulary. He solemnly told a divided Parliament that under no circumstances would he appoint a new UK commissioner to the European Union. And he announced that should Britain's European neighbors prove unwilling to let the country go its own way, listen to this language. Wow. Should the EU, wow, not let them do this. I mean, isn't that kind of the point of why they wanted to leave? Should Britain's European neighbors prove unwilling to let the country go its own way, he would leave the EU without agreeing to a deal, a course Theresa May considered too fraught with danger to undertake. One of them, either May or Johnson, is going to be vindicated in the eyes of history. To figure out who, we need to figure out why Brexit didn't happen. Why Britain's government has thus far not declared its independence from the EU despite an explicit promise to its people that it would do so. Summer 2019. Why Hasn't Brexit Happened? Claremont-Review-of-Books. Christopher Caldwell, page 33 in the print edition, which I have in my hand. I highly, and I don't do much highly because I don't do drugs. So it's very hard to do anything highly if you're not high. But I highly recommend this. Okay, I highly recommend this publication, and I highly recommend this episode. Obviously, I recommend the episode to you, but this piece. Why hasn't Brexit happened? Let's keep going.
I hate it when you pause like that and do that. You just keep reading it.
Okay, fine. I'm commenting. Yeah. Wow. To figure out who, we need to figure out why Brexit didn't happen, why Britain's government has thus far not declared its independence from the EU, despite an explicit promise to its people that it would do so. Perhaps in an interdependent world, national sovereignty is as unrealistic an indulgence as the EU's champions always claimed. Or perhaps the EU's ability to evade democratic accountability has proved even more robust and tenacious than the champions of Brexit had feared. We're still on page 33 of the print edition, but we're about to hit page 35 because page 34 is a big ad. By the way, the ads in the print edition are excellent. They're not annoying at all. They're always helpful. Project Fear. The EU was conceived by ambitious Cold War politicians. Yeah, let's get the background of the EU. What the heck is the European Union? What the heck is this? It's a post-World War II monstrosity. Now, World War II was also a monstrosity. This is me, not Chris Caldwell. So, is this monstrosity better than the other one? The EU was meant to stop World War III because World War I happened and World War II happened in Europe. All these daggum nations and tribes conflicting with each other. The idea was we got to bring people together. Project Fear. The EU was conceived by ambitious Cold War politicians as a federation in embryo, but presented to the public as an exercise in international friendship. Its main achievement has been to impose economic deregulation on duly elected national governments wherever they have resisted it, thus grooming Europeans for global capitalism. Grooming. I love that verb. Nice job, Chris. Nice job. But it has also made ever bolder claims to chart the destinies of the countries that make it up. Meddling in questions of school bullying in Spain, pensions in Italy, and press regulation in Hungary. Man, I want a sandwich after seeing that last country. European voters have been losing patience with the EU, even as zeal for it among local governing elites has risen. The Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath brought the United Kingdom into the European Economic Community, EEC, in 1973, and voters ratified the decision in a referendum 2 years later. But discontent spread, especially after the Maastricht Treaty of 1992 transformed the European community into the EU, setting its member countries on a path toward an ever closer union. Maastricht was narrowly and rancorously passed in the UK Parliament in a way that poisoned British politics, especially among conservatives or Tories, as they're sometimes called. Whenever British people were asked their feelings about the EU in a way that didn't activate either their insecurity, disliking the EU as low class, or their fear, leaving the EU will cause a depression, they opposed it. That's very interesting. It took constant vigilance to keep anti-EU sentiment from rising to the surface. This is very interesting. The large C Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron assented to the 2016 referendum in order to silence a rebellion of his small c Conservative colleagues. He did so reluctantly and put himself at the head of the pro-EU Remain forces. Although experts doubted voters would want to pull out of the EU, Cameron well understood that those experts were complacent. How can you be an expert if you're complacent? Fascinating philosophical question. That is why he turned the 2016 campaign into Project Fear, to use an expression of one of his own campaigners had coined for a different referendum 2 years earlier. He enlisted British businessmen to describe Brexit's dire consequences for employment. He commissioned studies from the Treasury to illustrate the deadly impact of Brexit on the British economy, and used government funds to have these studies printed in brochures that were distributed to every household in the country. Okay, I'm going to consult my paper copy here and just see if I have any notes. Okay, we're on page 35, Claremont Review of Books, paper edition, spring 2019. Okay. Those projections have turned out to be spectacularly off target. He invited leaders from around the world to warn Britons of the contempt in which the international ruling class would hold the United Kingdom if they favored London over Brussels. United States President Barack Obama, I remember him, went so far as to tell British voters that if they chose to leave the EU, they would find themselves at the back of the queue in their dealings with the United States. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Are you seeing some comparisons, some analogies with American politics? Well, he just mentioned Barack Obama. You might want to pay attention to that part. These elaborately manufactured and precision-timed bombshells were lobbed at the rate of one per news cycle throughout the spring of 2016. Shortly before the vote, Cameron even gathered veterans of World War II to his side as he warned that should his listeners be rash enough to exit the EU, the United Kingdom might soon reacquaint itself with what he called the serried rows of white headstones in lovingly tended Commonwealth war cemeteries. It was, in short, a thoroughly unfair campaign. But because the side against which the deck had been stacked won, the referendum seemed to have a calming effect. Turnout for the election had been massive, and the 52% to 48% victory extraordinary. The 17.4 million people who voted to leave the EU were the largest number of Britons who had ever voted for anything. I'm going to repeat that, and I'm going to read it in the paper copy. Get your copy today. Go to Claremont Review of Books and you'll get online access to the archive. This is free, so you already have that, but you get a paper copy sent in the mail, fresh ones. Turnout for the election had been massive. That's in 2016, the Brexit one. This is the one that Obama, yo mama, opposed. Turnout for the election had been massive, and the 52% to 48% victory extraordinary. The 17.4 million people who voted to leave the EU were the largest number of Britons who had ever voted for anything. Only the 1975 EEC referendum came close. No political party had ever come within 3 million votes of it. Just wanted to highlight that part. That's all. When we talk about democracy later, which we will. Independence ignored. It was reasonable to assume that in Britain's heart of hearts, absent peer pressure and government scare tactics, sentiments were even more pro-Brexit than the impressive majority at the ballot box could convey, and that the change of regime would be almost self-enacting. I'm going to cough for a sec. Hold on. TYSM, which means thank you, Santa Monica, when you text it. The government will implement what you decide, leaflets distributed during the referendum had promised. So the Brexit forces disbanded. Yes. See, Democrats never disband. The left never disbands. You better pay attention to this, people. So the Brexit forces disbanded. The beery, wiseacre Nigel Farage, whose UK Independence Party, UKIP, had focused single-mindedly on discontent with the EU, retired from politics. The Tories returned to business as usual. Upon Cameron's resignation, members chose as his successor the former Home Secretary Theresa May, who had not even backed Brexit herself. Pay attention. That seemed not to matter. Brexit means Brexit, May dutifully intoned. It was government policy. Brexit would be a bureaucratic sideshow to the real business of her premiership, which May laid out when she devoted her first major speech to 7 burning injustices, most of them involving race, class, and gender. On March 29, 2017, Parliament activated Article 50, which fixed the date for Britain's departure from the EU exactly 2 years later. Now, Brexit seemed locked in beyond the shadow of doubt. May then called and was nearly ousted in a general election on which the Brexit question had hardly any effect because her Labour foes treated the matter as settled. And then, 2 years later, and you're holding your breath, what happened 2 years later? No Brexit. That's right, guys. No Brexit. Better pay attention here. You better pay attention. I'm going to take a drink of water. It has been postponed. Remember, this is summer 2019, but it's relevant, and I'm not going to tell you why it's relevant. You're going to have to figure that out for yourself. At least, I mean, I'm not going to tell you right now. I'll tell you later. Okay, sorry. I didn't mean to snap at you. I'm just saying one thing at a time, okay? Merry Christmas. Joseph Christmas. If you can't say Merry Christmas at your work, say Joseph Christmas. Ask them what they have against women. Yes, Britain will regain its independence on October 31st if Brexit's adversaries do not find a way to block it. But those adversaries include almost the whole of Britain's political, economic, and journalistic elite, and they have been ingenious in finding ways to block it thus far. The largest and highest stakes exercise in democracy that the country ever engaged in, the culmination of decades of soul searching in which the country insisted on its independence, its national identity, and the primacy of its constitutional system, is at risk of simply being ignored. May left office in disgrace and in tears, burbling about race disparity audits and gender pay reporting and fair treatment for gays. I think he means homosexuals. I think, because I'm gay. I'm extremely gay. And I talked about that issue of being a gay Republican on TRP episode last January 20th, the day that Donald Trump was inaugurated a second time. It's called, appropriately, A Gay Republican, my interview with a wonderful gentleman named C.S. Snodgrass. Clive Staples Snodgrass Jr. for short. And he talks about how he found out he was gay. He was reading the dictionary, and he had just finished the letter F. And he was on G. He was early in the G's somewhere. I don't know exactly where. And he looked up from the dictionary and told his wife, "I think I'm gay." Perfectly legitimate subjects for another time, but not for a moment when the country's sovereignty hung in the balance. Her inability to understand the stakes of her 3-year premiership made her the country's most significant political failure since Neville Chamberlain. Damn. Whew. What does this mean for Boris Johnson? To the alarm of all Remainers, many of whom despise him, and even a good number of Brexiteers, many of whom envy him, it places him in the most Churchillian situation of any incoming premier since Margaret Thatcher after the strike-ridden winter of discontent in 1979, or possibly since Churchill himself in 1940. The press mostly sees Britain's current impasse as the result of some oversight or mistake, whether May's or the voting public's. Parliament has bungled Brexit, wrote a correspondent in the Conservative Telegraph. A national hemorrhage of shared purpose and belief began in earnest in June 2016, according to the Progressive Observer, when Britain voted to leave the EU. But this explanation is quite wrong, says Christopher Caldwell in Why Hasn't Brexit Happened, Summer 2019, Claremont-Review-of-Books. Get your copy. We're on page 35 of the print edition. But Claremont, at least today, has made this available to the public. And we thank you. Thank Claremont for making this available to the public. Go to Claremont Review of Books and throw some money their way. Reward publishers that publish good stuff. Otherwise, you're not going to get good stuff. You got to reward them. But this explanation is quite wrong. The divisions were there in the first place. In Britain, as elsewhere in the world, the struggle has been unleashed by innovations in administration that have arisen since the Cold War. These shift power from electorates and parliaments to managers of information, inside the government and out. From 1,000-year-old constitutional ideas to 5-year-old ones. From habeas corpus to gender identity. Because it was Britain that did the most to construct the ideal of liberty which is now being challenged, Brexit clarifies the constitutional stakes for the world as nothing else. Dang, dude. Over decades, British citizens have cloven into two parties of roughly equal strength. The Brexiteers are the party of the unwritten British Constitution as it existed from the Glorious Revolution of 1688 through 1689 until Britain's accession to the EU in 1973. This is the tradition of parliamentary supremacy, as John Locke called it, or parliamentary sovereignty, as it more often came to be called. It can be a confusing doctrine. In a constitutional context, Parliament means the House of Commons plus Lords plus the Queen. The Queen in Parliament is the ultimate lawmaking and constitution-making authority. The House of Commons legislates, and so, to a greater extent, does the House of Lords. The Cabinet exercises executive prerogatives in the name of the Queen. Courts can't overturn anything, though traditionally there was a role for the Lords as legal interpreters of last resort. Important parts of this arrangement have been scuppered, and if you favor that scuppering, you're probably a Remainer. Remainers are the party of the European Union's constitutional tradition, the tradition of human rights and judicial review. And to make things more confusing, of referenda. The 1973 vote to enter the EEC was the first the United Kingdom had ever had. The Brexit referendum of 2016 paradoxically used an EU-era innovation to put an end to the EU era. We're on page 36 of the print edition, and I just want to verify my notes here because I make notes on my copies. I want to make sure I tell you what I'm thinking about. Okay. So far, so good. Only once the process of Britain's secession got underway was it possible to understand fully the conflict between these two constitutional traditions. Federal Europe had penetrated British constitutional life much more thoroughly than Brexiteers could face or Remainers admit. EU law had become entrenched, to use a British legal term. As Brexit began disentrenching that law, it threatened to disentrench along with it the privileges of a whole class of people at the top of society. In response, that class coalesced with a mighty solidarity. Just after the Brexit vote, the London Review-of-Books essayist James Meek wrote of a gentle, cosmopolitan liberal friend who had asked him, "What about all these powerful backroom interests in the city that are supposed to have the government in their pocket? Why aren't they stepping in behind the scenes to stop this?" Britain's politics was coming to resemble something Donald Trump's advisor Steve Bannon had said in a different context in February 2017. Quote, if you think they're going to give you your country back without a fight, you're sadly mistaken. Unquote. The Constitution and the courts. Many statesmen warned from the outset that British ideas of liberty would not survive a merger with the EU. The most eloquent early diagnosis came from the Labour Party, not the Tories. That's interesting. That's an interesting historical tidbit right there. That is because the fundamental disposition of the EU is to favor technocratic expertise over representative government. And the Tories have not generally been the British party that placed the highest priority on the passions of the masses. In 1962, Tory Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was eyeing EEC membership. Labour leader Hugh Gateskill warned, quote, "It does mean the end of Britain as an independent nation state. It means the end of 1,000 years of history. You may say, let it end, but my goodness, it is a decision that needs a little care and thought," unquote. That's very interesting. Gateskill was right, but it is only in recent years that people have begun to see exactly why he was right. It was always understood that joining the EEC in 1973 compromised Britain's national sovereignty. All countries that joined had to acknowledge the supremacy of EU law over their own. This was a deadly serious thing if you reasoned the consequences to the end. For one thing, it deprived Britain's monarchy of its already somewhat vestigial logic. Monarchs are not underlings. In joining the EEC, Britain could be said to have deposed its queen. Isn't that interesting? It's like Judea in the first century under Roman occupation. There was a king there, King Herod, remember? But was he really a king? Monarchs are not underlings. In joining the EEC, Britain could be said to have deposed its queen. Pro-EU politicians assured their voters that it wasn't as serious as that. Britain, they said, had to give a little bit of its sovereignty up in order to receive the benefits of cooperation, the way it did in, say, NATO. Other European countries had done so without wrecking their systems. But this was a false analogy. I wouldn't say false. I would say it's a weak analogy. That's what I would say. This was a false analogy, as the political scientist Vernon Bogdanor explains persuasively in his recent book, Beyond Brexit. NATO was a treaty. EEC was a merger. What is more, the EEC that Britain joined had been designed by the major countries of continental Europe in line with their own traditions and interests. It was not in line with Britain's. Britain had no institutions like the European Commission, an unelected body that could, and still does, initiate legislation. Does that sound familiar? Does it sound like something we're talking about? Like, for example, I don't know, in the 14 episodes we've done in the last year on Chevron deference deep dive, if you're following that. Britain's politicians didn't understand the rules intuitively and were less able to work the system. British political institutions were unsuitable as a farm system for training EU politicians. And there was an even larger problem than the loss of national sovereignty, Bogdanor shows. The EU destroyed the system of parliamentary sovereignty at the heart of Britain's constitution. Now, let me just say here, I'm gonna stop here for a sec. We're on page 36 of the print edition. The parliamentary supremacy tradition that goes back to the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89 that Chris Caldwell references here in his wonderful piece that we're interacting with, which we're interacting, called "Why Brexit Hasn't Happened." Why hasn't Brexit happened? 2019 summer Claremont-Review-of-Books, starting at page 34. The American experiment here, the United States, was a revolt against parliamentary supremacy. The Federalist Papers doesn't call it parliamentary supremacy in that context. It calls it legislative supremacy. And the Federalist Papers warn in defending the proposed Constitution finished in the summer of 1787, and they defended the ratification in the Federalist Papers. The Federalist warns that the legislative power is like a vortex. It sucks up everything and takes the oxygen out of the room for protection of individual liberty, to be sure, but also secrecy, dispatch, energy, the focus that you need for government to do what it's designed to do appropriately. So the legislative vortex, the legislative supremacy that the founders were concerned with avoiding in the Federalist Papers in our Constitution, which our Constitution is designed to avoid and reject parliamentary supremacy, was in order to ensure that the government stays focused on what it's supposed to do and limited to those ends, protecting individual liberty in the process. But I'm going to say this, that Britain never went down that path until they joined they never went down that path that America went down. And so when you hear people talk about the civil rights movement in America, usually meaning the 1950s, 1960s, keep this in mind, that the civil rights movement goes back way further than that. It goes back to constitutional rights. It goes back to the structure of separation of powers, a rejection of legislative supremacy. Separating the powers, the executive, the legislative, and judicial, and a belief in limited government, but responsive government, responsive to the reasoned majority, reasonable majorities over time. So responsive to the better angels of our nature, not mere passions of majorities, which can prove quite fickle, but responsive to reasoned majorities over time. Representative government in that sense, which the EU rejects. So the EU is on the model of the administrative state here, which Loper Bright, which we're going through on the podcast, rejecting Chevron deference, is very much similar to that concern that you have unelected bureaucrats making laws. They're far away, they're in Washington, D.C., they're totally out of touch, and they have way too much power. Okay, let's continue.
That was really boring.
Sorry to hear that. You mean you're bored. I think what you mean is you're bored. Don't change the subject. The subject is you, not the material. The material is not boring. You're bored. But that says more about you than the subject. It doesn't say anything about the subject. It says something about you. Let's continue. For all its royalist trappings, Britain has traditionally been a much purer representative democracy than the United States because it excludes courts from reviewing legislation on any grounds. That's because they don't have a written constitution like we do. British politicians tried to calm the public with assurances that where British law and EU law clashed, British law would prevail. But the acknowledgement of EU legal supremacy in the treaties meant that EU law was British law. Oops. Oops. Oopsie. In the 1980s, British judges began finding that parliamentary laws had been invalidated by later British laws. A normal and time-honored process, except these new British laws had been imported into British statute books not by legislation, but by Britain's commitment to accept laws made on the continent. Bogdaner, who is a Remainer and a defender of human rights, does not necessarily condemn this development, but it meant that through the back door, judicial review was being introduced into a constitutional culture that never had it, which would be quite dangerous if you don't have a written constitution, by the way, either. Important. We have that. The Democrats are at war with our written constitution. They constantly talk about a living constitution. They don't talk about it as much as they used to because we've been so effective at, at shooting that view down. I don't know how to say this word. Quangos? I have no idea how to say that word. I'm sorry. I'm messing that up. I don't know that word. Quangos and foundations began designing cases concerning migrants' rights, gay rights, search and seizure that unraveled. What in the world? Quango? What is that? Okay, I'm going to have to look this up. I'm sorry. I don't know why I didn't look it up later before. I'm going to look this up really quick. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. I looked up that word and it appears that it's a body. It stands for a body of decision-making body of some kind. Okay. Quangos and foundations began designing cases concerning migrants' rights, gay rights, search and seizure that unraveled the centuries old fabric woven from the rights and duties of British citizenship. I've also got AirPods on now for my microphone. Let me know if there's a difference that's annoying or if it's better, if it's worse. Just let me know. Thanks. I appreciate it. A new fabric began to be woven, based as are all such systems in Europe, on post-Civil Rights Act American law and on the litigative ethos of the American bar. Litigative. Oh, brother. Oh, brother. Cannot believe it, man. Legislative. So you see the Civil Rights Act material that we're working on in Chris Caldwell's book, Age of Entitlement. Yeah, he's the same guy. It's the same guy. Coming into Brexit. I bet you didn't see that coming. There it is. It's right there. A new fabric began to be woven based as are all such systems in Europe, on post-Civil Rights Act American law and on the litigative ethos of the American bar. This is very important because this is code, Civil Rights Act is code for litigation. It's code for empowering courts to get into every little decision, eroding freedom of association, eroding what we would consider constitutional rights. In our case, it's constitutional conflict, eroding discretion, which was taken for granted. In 1998, Labor Prime Minister Tony Blair passed the Human Rights Act, which swept into British law the European Convention on Human Rights, a pre-EU document dating from 1953. It also bound Britain to abide by decisions reached by the European Court of Human Rights, which sits in the French city of Strasbourg. Hmm. Article 8.1 of the Convention, everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home, and his correspondence, was supposed to protect people from the prying eyes of the state, as our Fourth Amendment does. I know what you're thinking here. What can possibly go wrong? But as the judge and scholar Jonathan Ford Sumption noted in a series of lectures this summer, it quickly became the functional equivalent of the Due Process Clause of the American 14th Amendment. Grounds for all kinds of judicial adventurism. British judges discovered that Article 8, here's a block quote. It's a block quote. Quote, potentially covers anything that intrudes upon a person's autonomy unless the court considers it to be justified. The legal status of illegitimate children, immigration and deportation, extradition, criminal sentencing, the recording of crime, abortion, artificial insemination, homosexuality, and same sex unions, child abduction, the policing of public demonstrations, employment and social security rights, environmental and planning law, noise abatement, eviction for non-payment of rent, and a great deal else besides, unquote. Did you hear that? Rewind it. Rewind it if you didn't hear it. In the late 1990s, Blair began a reform in the House of Lords, depriving all but a few dozen hereditary peers of their right to sit. He replaced those ousted with a body that was meant to be more meritocratic, but wound up less diverse and arguably more class-bound, a collection of activist foundation heads, rights barristers, as legal agitators are called, think tank directors and in the tank journalists and political henchmen. See, I didn't know all this. I did not know all this. We're on page 37 of the print edition. I mean, I did not know all this stuff. But these connections with American politics is really important and valuable. Let's continue. Let's keep going. I'm hoping these earphones are okay. Um, I had these skull candy ones kind of hanging from my glasses. These have been pretty good. When I'm reading, I like to have them on because I move my head around. When I'm interviewing somebody, I use this microphone. It's a Razer that was sent to me by Tommy Robinson, former CFO of Hawaiian Tropic, a TRP supporter. Thank you, Tommy. Woohoo! Just saw him in Tennessee. Great time. Okay, So you have all these people, the elite, the establishment, as it's sometimes called. Okay, so judicial functions that the House of Lords once carried out were calved off into an actual Supreme Court, which took over as the High Court of the land, with no written constitution to check it, by the way. Check it before you wreck it. Eventually, even the reliably anti Brexit economist came to see that some of Britain's major problems had arisen from constitutional meddling. David Cameron's 2011 Fixed Term Parliaments Act, in particular, made it much more difficult to call the elections that would ordinarily have been provoked by the resounding repudiation of Theresa May's withdrawal package. Blair and Cameron, the magazine noted, came to power when history was said to have come to an end. They saw no need to take particular care of the Constitution. Jeez. EU membership hid these problems. If Britain wasn't paying attention to its constitution at the time, it was partly because it had been using someone else's. This is great writing. Thank you, Chris Caldwell, for writing this. Thank you, Claremont Review of Books, for publishing it, making it available. Go to ClaremontReviewofBooks.com. Subscribe today. 2019, Why Hasn't Brexit Happened? We're on page 37 of the print edition, which I have in my hand, and I make note on. These shifts in Britain's constitutional culture have become obvious during the rolling European migration crisis of recent decades. The more courts took control of immigration policy, the harder immigration was to stop. Wow. Okay, do you see a connection here with what's happening with all these deportations in the United States? The Democrats wanted a bunch of migrants coming in. I mean, the connections are all over the place. What we're doing is we're soaking right now. We're soaking in the material. I want you to take it in, like magnesium with bath salts. Just take it in. Okay. Let it simmer in your mind and your soul. Take it in. Let's continue. These shifts in Britain's constitutional culture have become obvious during the rolling European migration crisis of recent decades. The more courts took control of immigration policy, the harder immigration was to stop. As Home Secretary under David Cameron, May promised to limit Britain's galloping population growth to tens of thousands a year, not hundreds of thousands. But net migration has been running at around 250,000 ever since, rising as high as 333,000 in 2015. Last year, according to Migration Watch UK, net migration was 258,000. That means 74,000 Europeans added to 232,000 non-Europeans who arrived and 48,000 Britons who left. May was just a talker when it came to immigration policy, but no politician in 3 decades had done any better. Once the judiciary rules politics, all politicians are just talkers. Understand that, and you are most of the way to understanding Brexit. The transfer of competences from legislatures to courts is a superb thing for the rich because of the way the Constitution interacts with occupational sociology. Now, pay attention to this. Pay attention. I'm going to take a drink of water so I can do justice to this. Pay attention. Where the judiciary is drawn from the legal profession, and where the legal profession is credentialed by expensive and elite professional schools, judicialization always means a transfer of power from the country at large to the richest sliver of it. This is true no matter what glorious sounding pretext is found to justify the shift. Racial harmony, European peace, a fair shake for women. In a global age, judicial review is a tool that powerful people expect to find in a constitution, in the same way one may expect to find a hair dryer in a hotel room, negotiating the withdrawal. We're still on page 37 of the print edition. From the beginning, a certain number of Remainers had called for for a second referendum, arguing that the people had not really known what they were voting for when they chose Brexit. The independent newspaper had the gall to call this hypothetical rerun a people's vote, though sometimes they called it a final say. The people themselves were suspicious. It was the oldest trick in the EU book to hold second referenda when, and only when, the public's wishes diverged from those of Brussels. It had been used in Denmark in 1993 and in Ireland. Shannon, I'm of Ireland and I'll stay in Ireland until I die. Far and away, anybody? Tom Cruise? No? Okay. And in Ireland in 2002 and in 2009. By 2017, though, these do-overs had become a Europe-wide symbol of contempt for voters. And that is why Parliament voted overwhelmingly in March 2017 to validate the referendum, activate EU's Article 50, and fix the date for British withdrawal. But there were a couple of details left. Article 50 called for a 2-year negotiating period between the seceding country and the EU in order that the two might come to an optimal post-separation arrangement. From the outset, there was a dangerous asymmetry of motives. Britain had nothing against its neighbors on the continent. It sought only the right to make its own decisions again. The EU's leaders, however, had an incentive to inflict maximum hardship on Britain. In most member countries, the EU was being blamed for stagnating economies, dizzying inequality, and out of control immigration. If Britain were granted a pain-free exit, others would follow suit. Early in the negotiating process, Britain's ambassador to the EU, the Brussels insider Evan Rogers, submitted his resignation, warning that Britain was going to get its head handed to it at the bargaining table. Serious multilateral negotiating experience is in short supply in Whitehall, he wrote, and that is not the case in the European Commission or in the Council. He was right about that, and it was a lesson in the sociology of Brexit. In England, at least, the electoral map of Brexit looked like the electoral map of Donald Trump's presidential victory in America would look like that later that year. Remain was the choice of those who benefited from the global economy. It won overwhelmingly in a few compact islands of rich people, intellectuals, and minorities. London, Oxford, Cambridge. The ranks of Remain-aligned politicians were crowded with well-educated, tech-savvy, cosmopolitan people. Leave won every place else. Leave means Brexit. It was the choice of yesterday's Britain, the Britain of losers. Not that Chris Caldwell thinks that, but that the elite and the Democrats think that. The left, basically. Even after its victory, okay, hold on. Let me give you an update on what page we're on. We're on page 38. Okay. Even after its victory, leave, that is, so there's two, right? There's leave and remain. Brexit is leave. Leave found itself constantly outthought, outclassed, and outworked by remain. May made David Davis, a party bull approaching the end of his career, her chief negotiator. He didn't seem to think the post would require too much energy, expertise, or imagination, because at the end of the day, Britain could walk away from the negotiating table with no deal. How could May have put Brexit at risk by picking someone like Davis to secure it? How could Donald Trump have put his presidency at risk by picking someone like Jeff Sessions to defend it? The answer in both cases was the same. In populist causes, the pickings are slim, personnel wise. Oh man, you guys, we could marinate in this point right here for the rest of the episode and the rest of the week. Okay. Why do you think I'm doing this podcast? Why do you think I call it the Republican Professor? The contempt for elites is understandable, but as my friend and a guest on this podcast, Matthew Peterson, he's now editor in chief at Blaze. Matthew Peterson said, we don't need to get rid of elites. We need better elites. That's what we need. We need elites that really are elite. Our side is not against elites. We're about creating better ones, ones that actually are. And guys, we got a situation where Ivy League students apparently can't even read books anymore. They can't even read a book. Finally, Democrats are saying this in their Democrat publications. Surprised anybody's left to read those damn things. I've been saying this for a long time. That's because they don't read books in high school. We're cruising for a bruising, people. Not good. Not good. Am I angry about it? Do ducks swim? The Continental negotiators, by contrast, were the cream of Europe's educated classes. The EU is a highly elaborated administrative state. Indeed, it is an especially logical and efficient one because it has developed before the underlying society. So there were no pragmatic or traditional considerations to complicate its rules or shrink its remit. Rogers loved legalistic gobbledygook, noting that the EU tacticians would know how to withhold adequacy determinations under the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and they were masters of, quote, equivalence decisions, unquote, whatever any of that meant. His slashing book on the whole Brexit process, Nine Lessons in Brexit, is the title of it, would become a Bible of London's pro-EU intellectuals, from historian Seaman Stamma to Harry Potter creator J.K. Rowling. But to read it is to be stuck by a blind spot. Constantly belittling the public for not understanding the ins and outs of negotiating trade agreements, Rogers, for all his smarts, failed to understand that A, this was a negotiation about something deeper than trade, and B, the sovereign people sets parameters for negotiators, not vice versa. Rogers could not see that his countrymen did not feel the same loyalty to the EU and its process that he did. He could not imagine why people would want it to go away. Thank you, Chris Caldwell, for writing or on why hasn't Brexit happened? Summer 2019, Claremont Review of Books, page 38, right now in the print edition. Where loyalties lie. Let me just double check my print edition here. I mean, I just have written down here quotation mark, underlying a little bit. Wow. Yes. I'm just where loyalties lie. Rogers and other British experts were strangely unimpressed by the powerful practical levers on their own side disposed of. Britain was the largest importer of cars from Germany. It had a trade deficit with most countries on the continent, which means that any breakdown in talks would idle more European factories than British ones. It was, with France, one of only two serious military powers in Western Europe. It had an intelligence gathering relationship with the United States that continental Europe was desperate to preserve the benefits of. It contained 40% of Europe's data servers. It was due to recover its own rich fishing banks, schools of mackerel north of Scotland, beds of prawns southwest of Cornwall, where EU vessels took 59% of the haul. And it was the financial capital of the world. The EU would have no choice but to do business with an independent Britain. We're on page 39. And yet there was a hangdog tone in all elite descriptions of the Article 50 discussions. People were wishing their own country ill in an international negotiation. If I were an EU negotiator, wrote Liberal Democrat member of Parliament Sir Ed Davey in a fantasy of his own country's humiliation that appeared in The Independent, my starting position would be to increase the divorce fee to £50, British pounds, arguing that the UK must now pay the oh, sorry. My negotiation would be to increase the divorce fee to 50. I don't know how to say this. I'm sorry. Billion. Sorry about that. 50 billion. Arguing that the UK must now pay the EU's cost of handling the no deal Brexit after refusing the first deal. Given the severely negative impact of a no deal Brexit on everything from our sheep farmers to our NHS, National Health Service, I rather think that any UK government would be so desperate to make some deals that 50 billion might seem a bargain. Remainers' hearts were with the European side at the table, not with the Brexiteers who were supposed to be their countrymen. There may be an innocent epistemological explanation for this. When a regime is changing, the old world is made of concrete things that have lost their legitimacy, while the world to come is made up of legitimate things that have not yet become concrete. Rogers hated the whole enterprise of undoing existing EU structures. We are privileging notional autonomy to make our own laws over real power to set the rules by which in practice we shall be governed. That's what he said. In the Financial Times, columnist Martin Wolf similarly saw no point in the Brexiteer reluctance to bind Britain's trade policy to the EU's. It would only prevent the UK from making trade deals that are less important than maintaining good relations with the EU, Wolf wrote in the Financial Times. Every negotiator on the British side behaved as if there were nothing more important than maintaining good relations with the EU. Perhaps that was to be expected. The EU pursues the goal of transcending, a fancy a way to say getting rid of, the nation states that make it up. As the union grows ever closer, there must eventually come a moment when the loyalty of subjects is transferred from the institutions of the nation to those of federal Europe. Brexit showed that for elites to whom the EU offers a grand role, that moment has come already. The EU, not Britain, is their country. They saw Brexit not as most British people did, as a solemn and even sacred uprising by an ancient people against a usurper. No, elites saw Brexit as a local nuisance in the domestic politics of the only legitimate custodian of Britain's long term interests, the EU. Theresa May fell under the influence of these views, particularly after dropping Conservative advisor Nick Timothy in the days after her general election loss in 2017. It was Timothy who had written her Brexit Means Brexit speech. Without him, she too lost sight of what Brexit was. Brexit turned into a word that meant its opposite. It was now a damage limitation exercise, as Timothy would later put it. May came to believe that Brexit meant honoring the patriotic emotions that had led to a national temper tantrum while protecting the country against any foolish actions that might result from such emotions, such as breaking relations with the European Union. This is really well written. This is great. Man. In mid 2017, May opted for getting experts on board. Ollie Robbins, an EU friendly aide who had risen under Tony Blair and David Cameron, and who had been Rogers' successor as Blair's private secretary, took over as lead negotiator from the Brexiteer Davis. The Irish backstop. Brexiteers now began to suspect that May's own negotiators were conniving with the European Union's to trap Britain in EU membership. The means of doing this would be Ireland. In 1998, Britain had negotiated the Good Friday Agreement, a treaty aimed at quelling the guerrilla war with terrorist Irish Republican Army that had waged for decades in order to reunite 6 Northern Irish counties that belonged to the UK with the 26 southern ones that belonged to the Irish Republic. The EU insisted that on a guarantee, now referred to as the Irish backstop, that after Brexit, Britain would remain a soft border with Ireland, an EU member state. It was an unusual demand for a number of reasons. There had never been a hard border between the two countries outside of military emergencies, nor was there a need for one now. Britain and Ireland were part of the same island region, cut off by ocean and law from EU's Schengen, an area of free movement. Schengen, I don't know how to say that. Sorry. Looks like a German name. Schengen, an area of free movement. Britain had as much reason to demand border guarantees from the EU as the EU did from Britain. And while such borders might present new challenges after Brexit, there were proven solutions. Non EU Switzerland, for example, keeps its borders, travel, and trade open with four major EU countries. These problems only became insoluble when EU diplomats discovered they might be used to tangle up Brexit negotiations. Fascinating. We're on page 40 of the print edition. Fascinating. In December 2017, May made a terrible mistake. She agreed in a joint EU-UK report that there would be no diminution of rights for anyone in Northern Ireland. This was a promise inconsistent with Brexit. Northern Ireland, like every place else in the United Kingdom, would have its native constitutional regime restored by Brexit. As such, it would be moving from a polity that operates primarily through court-conferred rights back into one that operates primarily through the will of Parliament. While the Northern Irish might wind up more free, happy, and self-reliant, their rights would be delineated and protected in different ways in some respects, and in some respects, this difference would be a diminution. Rogers had been right about the skill of EU negotiators. They had taken the backstop, an issue that no one had even considered until Brexit voted, and turned it into an EU veto on the whole of Brexit. Some suggested that Northern Ireland remain under the same customs regime as the Irish Republic, but under the terms of the 1998 peace agreement, it couldn't. The most important guarantee to Northern Ireland had been that Britain would not make any change in the status of Northern Ireland in its relation to the rest of the UK, save with the consent of the majority of its people. Making Northern Ireland subject to the laws of a foreign country would count as a rather large change in status. But this difficulty prompted May's negotiators to come up with a more ambitious solution. The backstop would cause no change in Northern Ireland's status within the UK if the whole UK could be included in the European customs area. So Britain could solve the problems created by its departure from the European Union by agreeing to remain subject to the European Union. You see how this works? You see how this works, guys? Man, this is what, so you see why he's such a great writer? Do you understand why I love Chris Caldwell? Do you understand that now? Did you not understand it before? I love it. This is awesome. Let's continue. An abyss opened up in July 2018 at the Prime Ministerial Retreat of Chequers when May released a plan for future relations with Brussels. It called for harmonization with EU rules and regulations, described the backstop in a way that made it look inescapable, and envisioned a role for European Court of Justice. Johnson said that May was volunteering for economic vassalage and resigned as Foreign Secretary. We continue to make the fatal mistake of underestimating the intelligence of the public, saying one thing to the EU about what we're doing and saying another to the electorate, he explained. In important ways, this is Brexit in name only. Davis resigned too. The final negotiated withdrawal agreement that May unveiled to Parliament last November caused the whole country, Brexiters and Remainers alike, to gasp in horror. We're on page 40, the print edition. See if I have any notes. Keep going. May's team had been sent away to declare British independence and had returned with a document of surrender. The agreement not only contained, as expected, a 39 billion, 50 billion divorce fee, $50 billion divorce fee, but also left EU courts free to top that fee up. It locked Britain into a customs union with the EU and with no mechanism for leaving ever. The EU and the EU alone would decide when Britain had fulfilled the backstop agreement, and any move to break it unilaterally on Britain's part would be resolved by giving the EU jurisdiction over Northern Ireland's economic relations. It subjected Britain to EU trade sanctions more onerous than those meted out to other countries. It laid out contexts in which EU law could retain its supremacy over UK law. The withdrawal agreement not only did not end Britain's ties to the EU, in the name of Brexit, it actually deepened and constitutionalized them. This ensured that pro Brexit Tories would not vote for it, but it also renounced Britain's official membership in EU institutions, and indeed its right to have any say in them, dooming it for anti Brexiters of all parties. In January, it was rejected in Parliament by the largest margin of any measure in British parliamentary history. It was subsequently rejected twice more. Let's see here this again. In January, this is January of 2000. Let's see here. When was this? No, last November. Okay, so this had been January 2019. In January 2019, it was rejected in Parliament by the largest margin of any measure in British Parliament history. Jeez. I think we're on page 41 now. Oh, well, what do you know? You want to know what my comment was? Geez, man, this is insane. The withdrawal agreement thrilled Remainers, even if they wouldn't vote for it, and breathed new life into their cause. They could now present the agreement not as a twisted document put together by pro Remain bureaucracy, but as a faithful depiction of modern reality. We told you there was no possible governing arrangement better than the European Union. Back came Project Fear, now carried out by the Financial Times, The Guardian, The Independent. Back came the calls for a people's vote, and back came the call. Back came all the scare vocabulary about how a no deal Brexit would cause Britain to go over the cliff edge and crash out of the European Union. Once the withdrawal agreement failed, no deal was the form that independence had to take. It would be no deal or no Brexit, and Remainers were alarmed to realize that no deal Brexit was the law. It had been agreed on March 29th, 2017, and it would automatically become reality on March 29th, 2019, unless something could be done to stop it. So the deep state intervenes. This is the next section here. Deep state intervenes. We're on page 41 of the print edition. This is publicly available on Claremont-Review-of-Books.com. Go there, throw some money at them. The deep state intervenes. It was surprising how much could be done to stop it. Remainers were a synonym for the governing class. They had an infinity of tools, and they were no longer scared of the voters. No one wanted to be so contemptuous as to repeal Brexit, but Parliament could put a no deal Brexit on hold which it did. May's negotiators had already produced a Brexit deal that caused misgivings among the Brexiters themselves. The Prime Minister's cabinet secretary, a powerful member of the career civil service, now wrote a 14-page memo warning that no deal would lead to higher food prices and more crime. Someone in May's office helpfully forwarded it to the Daily Mail. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, warned that Parliament may have to repeal Article 50 to protect the value of the pound. May herself entered into consultation with the old school Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn to see if he would help pass her deal, in the course of which she even offered to agree to a second referendum. Perhaps that revealed what May had thought of Brexit all along. It was not a constitutional demand, but a psychiatric symptom. This is great. Some of the most extraordinary moments of these winter debates involved the interventions of the Speaker of the House, John Bercow. Elected as a conservative, he had, in David Souter-esque fashion, discovered once in power he actually opposed conservative policies on most things, very much including Brexit. On April 3rd, Bercow transferred control of primary legislation from the government, as the cabinet is called when it presents legislation in Parliament, to a group of Brexit rebels. That did away with a rule on which Parliament had done business for the last 330 years and threw the country into a serious constitutional quarrel. Anti-Brexiters used their control of debate to pass the European Union Withdrawal Act 2019, which ordered Theresa May to seek an extension of Brexit from the European Union. And that began the process that led to postponing the Brexit deadline until October 31st. Once the legislature had seized the power of the executive, the genie could not be returned to the bottle. Brexiters now understood that Bercow might unilaterally block any moves toward Brexit, rendering parliamentary debate futile. Some Tories began to think, what if Parliament were prorogued, kept out of session until the next deadline passed? Labour had resorted to a prorogation in 1948, which made the idea less of a trespass on parliamentary procedure than Bercow's. In the event, the prorogation maneuver was blocked by an amendment in the House of Lords that essentially bans Parliament from going out of session in October. The failure of Brexit was the worst humiliation of a British government in decades, deepened by the sudden realization that Britain would have to take part in the European Union elections in late May. In early April, Nigel Farage announced his return to politics and hastily assembled a ragtag formulation called the Brexit Party. 5 weeks later, with a list of nobodies, has-beens, and famous politicians' sisters, Farage's Brexiters took 29 of Britain's 73 seats to become the single biggest party in European Parliament. May's Tories took only four. Johnson announced his bid for the leadership, saying, there is a very real choice between getting Brexit done and the potential extinction of this great party. We're on page 41 still, making things explicit. I'm going to change my audio. All right, I've got the skull candy hanging from my glasses again for a microphone. We'll see what happens here. We'll see if it's better or what. I'm just doing an experiment here. Got the AirPods out now. Skull candy dangling from the glasses now. Yeah. Just double checking. Okay, let's continue. Making things explicit. Page 41. Chris Caldwell, Claremont Review of Books. Why hasn't Brexit happened? Summer 2019. Go to ClaremontReviewBooks.com. Get a subscription. Most commentary on Brexit dismisses those who sought it as fanaticists, and the parliament that debated it as a madhouse. Bungle is the favored verb in most articles on the subject, which generally explain that Britain's difficult winter and spring illustrate what a misbegotten idea Brexit was in the first place. The Dutch diplomat Frans Timmermans, a veteran EU commissioner involved in negotiations, told the BBC that his British counterparts had been running around like idiots. European Council President Donald Tusk said, I've been wondering what the special place in hell looks like for those who promoted Brexit without even a sketch of a plan of how to carry it safely. Washington Post columnist Fareed Zakaria said in March, Britain, famous for its prudence, propriety, and punctuality, is suddenly looking like a banana republic as it makes reckless decisions, misrepresents reality, and now wants to change its own self imposed deadline. But the reasons for the chaos of the past winter and for the fact that Brexit has still not happened lies elsewhere. Tell us, Chris, where does it lie? Chris Caldwell, author of Age of Entitlement, which we're covering also on this podcast. See those episodes. Brexit is an epical struggle for power, an exemplary one. It pits a savvy elite against a feckless majority. There have been scares before for those who run the institutions of global governance, the rise of Syriza in Greece with its attack on the common European currency, the election of Donald Trump, the nation-based immigration restrictions put forward by Italian Interior Minister Matteo Salvini and Hungarian President Viktor Orban. But it is Brexit that has hit bedrock. If Brexit happens, our future will look one way. If not, it will look another. Those people who warn, as Zakaria does, that voting for Brexit has decreased Britain's importance in the world, are they joking? Only when the Leave side won the referendum did it become clear that the vote had been about not just a policy of preference, but also an identity. It raised the question for each voter of whether he considered himself an Englishman or a European, and of whether it was legitimate to be ruled by one power or the other. As such, it made certain things explicit. The main legacy of the European Union in the past 3 decades has been the suppression of democracy and sovereignty in the countries that belong to it. We can argue about whether this is the main purpose of the Federation, but the suppression of self rule certainly counts as one of its purposes. Extinguishing national sovereignty was EU's technocrats' way of assuring that what Germany, Italy, and Spain set in motion in the 20th century would not repeat itself in the 21st. The architects of the Brussels Order proclaimed this intention loudly until they discovered it cost them elections and support. The EU's suspicion of nationalism is understandable, but its hostility to democracy is real. The self-image of today's EU elites is still that of protecting Europe from its historic dark side. They are confident history will regard them as the fathers of a common European home. In the imaginary biography he carries around inside his own head, the A British builder of the European Union, whether a human rights lawyer or a hectoring journalist, will cast himself as one of the righteous heroes of his time, one of the enlightened. He is a man who stood alone to fight for his principles, and so on. Maybe posterity will even see him as a European James Madison. Many people in all member states have sought to puncture this kind of bureaucrat self-regard, but Britain's anti-EU intellectuals have been particularly direct and pitiless. In mid-July, Robin Harris, a longtime advisor to Cold War Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, wrote an article in the Telegraph urging Boris Johnson to carry out a peaceful but revolutionary seizure of power by the British people from a supranational authority and a homegrown but deracinated collaborationist elite. Deracinated. Why do I not know what that word means? Crap. Deracinated. I don't know why I didn't know what that word meant. As soon as I stopped recording, I knew what it meant. Yeah. It's right there in the spelling of it, right? It's right there in the spelling of it. Deracinated, right? Derace, right? Derace, meaning decouple from racial identity or geographical linguistic identity. Imagine how it strikes a man who has spent decades working for the EU dream, Tony Blair or Donald Tusk, for instance, to see his work likened to collaboration. Special place in hell indeed. Those who sought the Brexit referendum placed a proposition before the British electorate that these self-styled architects of Europe, these idealists, had been all along not Europeans, not Europe's Madisons, but its Quislings. Apparently, that was a collaborationist in some previous war with the enemy, I'm assuming. Worse, when that proposition was placed before the British people, they assented to it. Brexit was not an outburst or a cry of despair or a message to the European Commission. It was an eviction notice. It was an explicit withdrawal of the legal sanction under which Brussels had governed Europe's most important country. If it is really Britain's wish to see its old constitutional arrangements restored, then this notice is open to amendation and reconsideration. But as things stand now, the Leave vote made EU rule over the UK illegitimate. Not illegitimate only when Brussels has been given one last chance to talk Britain out of it, but illegitimate now. What Britons voted for in 2016 was to leave the European Union, not to ask permission to leave the European Union. It is hard to see how Britain's remaining in the EU would benefit either side. And yet, given that Britain is the first country to issue such an ultimatum, given that pro-EU elites in other European countries have reason to fear its replication, given the moral ambitions of the EU project, given that the British who support Remain have transferred their sentiments and their allegiances across the channel, given the social disparity between those who rule the EU and those who want to leave it, how could the reaction of Britain's establishment be anything but all-out administrative, judicial, economic, media, political, and parliamentary war. The battle against Brexit is being fought Europe-wide with all the weaponry a cornered elite has at its disposal. It has proved sufficient so far. Christopher Caldwell is a contributing editor at the Claremont Review of Books. This is a powerful piece. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. It is 10 December 2025, years after Jesus. It's a Wednesday.